For those who don't know or are not familiar with Dr. Vine, he preached a sermon not too long ago about religious liberty and the SDA Church relating to the COVID-19 vaccine mandates. And there's a bit of controversy going on in the church now, and a few pastors, such as the ones pictured here, have spoken out against the message of Dr. Vine. And Dr. Vine himself has got a lot of supporters, and so there's a bit of conflict in the SDA church there. So today we're going to discuss who is in the right. Did the SDA church make an appropriate statement when they said that it's not appropriate to claim religious liberty when seeking an exemption from the COVID vaccines? Or was Dr. Vine correct when he said that the SDA, specifically the AdCom committee of the GC, fell far short of their duty by stating that very thing, that members of the SDA Church can't appeal to religious liberty in order to obtain an exemption for the COVID-19 vaccine mandates? So who's correct? And at the end of this study, we're going to discuss: is the SDA Church dependable to provide support and defense of our religious liberty as members? Well, I'm not a member of the SDA Church, but can the SDA Church members depend upon it and upon the GC to support them when government mandates conflict with their consciences and their duty towards God? Is the SDA Church trustworthy to defend religious liberty now that it's made the statement about the vaccines? So for a lot of the information in the study, I obtained most of it from healthministries.com. That's the Advent Health Ministries. It's the official website, and if you just go /coronavirus or click on the COVID-19 button on their website, scroll down and you get the vaccine information article list, and all the documents that I read that are related to the COVID vaccines are there, and the ones that are linked that are mentioned in the study also. So to start off, we'll go, if you find this article, reaffirming Adventist Church response to COVID-19. Now this contains the AdCom statement that drew so much controversy from Dr. Vine's sermon. And this is the key point in that statement: vaccine programs that are generally being carried out are important for the safety and health of our members and the larger community. Therefore, claims of religious liberty are not used appropriately in objecting to government mandates or employer programs designed to protect the health and safety of their communities. So the Adventist Church stated that claims of religious liberty are not used appropriately when you object to vaccine government mandates. So you can state it a bit differently. It's a weird way to word it, but if you state it a bit differently, you can say that it's not appropriate to claim religious liberty when objecting to government mandates. It's not appropriate to claim religious liberty when objecting to government mandates, or certain government mandates concerning the vaccines. So is it correct that, as the AdCom committee stated, that it's not appropriate to claim religious liberty in the case of COVID or vaccine mandates? That's what the bulk of the study will be about. Now let's go back. In this article here, addressing concerns, offering counsel, this here is stated: it is important for our comments to be understood within the framework of our official church position on immunization. So they made the AdCom statement in 2021, but this comes previous to that, and they're saying when we make our statements, make sure you understand our statements within the framework of our official church position. Okay, so we'll try to understand when the GC submitted that it's not appropriate to claim religious liberty in the case of vaccine mandates. It's not appropriate, they say. So we're going to try and understand it in the official church position. The official church position starts, the Advent health emphasis is based on biblical revelation, the inspired writing of Ellen G. White, and on peer-reviewed scientific literature. So these three things, science, E.G. White, and the Bible. These three things are what the GC states are what informs the Advent health message. So this is what they say. This is what they claim. Here we have the Bible, E.G. White, and science. Now, the Bible here, it's pretty obvious to say that it doesn't list and state everything about the health message and activities that can harm or benefit your health. The Bible mainly directs us to principles, and then from there we have to investigate for ourselves what is in line with these principles. So for instance, when it comes to alcohol, the Bible actually does give direct instruction in abstaining from alcohol. But other things like smoking, it's not so clear. The Bible doesn't say thou shalt not take any tobacco. So the Bible doesn't state, but it does have certain biblical principles that we can draw upon when deciding whether or not it's appropriate for Christians to smoke. Both E.G. White and science specifically give specific instructions regarding smoking. They say that it's harmful to your body, and in Spirit of Prophecy case it says that it's a sin to take tobacco, and there's no tobacco in heaven, something like that. So the Bible gave the principle, science gave the specific instruction, and E.G. White gives both. It gives a bit of principle and it gives a bit of instruction. Not all instruction, it's not complete an exhaustive textbook on morality, but it does give principles and it does give some specific instructions. Now when we come to coffee, there's a bit of a discrepancy here. The Bible doesn't say anything. The Bible gives principles like look after your body, look after your glorify God in your body and in your spirit. However, in the Spirit of Prophecy it says tea and coffee are absolutely harmful to your system and should be discarded. Science, on the other hand, there's a little bit of a disagreement, or there's a lot of disagreement whether or not coffee is bad or even if it's a benefit to you in the scientific community. So in this case, where the Bible gives a principle, Ellen G. White gives a specific instruction, science we have to place beneath the instructions of Ellen G. White. Even though if we don't understand exactly how and why coffee is so debilitating that we should avoid it at all costs, we still should trust in the Word of God, trust in the Spirit of Prophecy, and submit to its direction. So science isn't always right. Science is the one that we can't depend entirely upon. The other two we can. Now, so this is the basis. This is what the statement of the GC of Seventh-day Adventism states, that the SDA health message is informed by the Bible, Ellen G. White, and they say peer-reviewed literature, which is we just got here as science. Okay, so as a church, we support evidence-based public health recommendations. We are also careful not to make pronouncements that may be construed as replacing national and international public health guidelines. Now hold on a minute here. The position of the church is that it is informed when it comes to health by the Bible, E.G. White, and science. But now we're talking about peer-reviewed science, I should say, scientific literature. Now we're talking about public health recommendations and national and international public health guidelines. So this is different now. This is another branch of the tree. Or, yeah, this is not, it's not peer-reviewed literature, it's not the Bible, it's not Ellen G. White, it's guidelines dictated to us by certain committees within governmental organizations. So the health message of the SDA Church is really informed by the Bible, E.G. White, and science, but also it has to filter through the public health guidelines, because remember, we just read here that the Church is careful not to make pronouncements that may be construed as replacing national and international health guidelines. So, even if the Bible, E.G. White, and the science inform us on a specific topic, if they conflict with the public health guidelines, national or international, the SDA Church will be careful not to make that pronouncement. The official position of the SDA Church comes filtered through the public health guidelines. It's not going to contradict the public health guidelines. Now that's a big problem, because who is forming these public health guidelines? Now the question is, should the Church support those who require such support for a liberty of conscience exemption from vaccine mandates? So sometimes when I was in university, actually, an exam was scheduled, one of my exams was scheduled to be on the Sabbath day, and I had to obtain an exemption. Now the only way I could obtain an exemption based on religious grounds was to get a signed statement from my pastor that said that the Sabbath day is sacred, and as a church we hold to the belief that we should not do any work on God's holy day, and that taking an exam would violate that belief and that position of the church and its members. So I had to get support from the church in order to obtain an exemption from taking an exam on Sabbath, and I took it on Sunday instead. Now should the church support those now, if it comes to vaccine mandates, if an individual needs the support of the church to obtain an exemption from vaccine mandates, should the church support that individual just as my church supported me in getting an exemption? And that's what the big issue was with Conrad Vine. The church did not, they said it's not appropriate to use religious liberty as a claim for obtaining an exemption, and they did not support the individual members personally by providing them with faith or religious-based grounds for the exemption. So now we want to determine, was the church correct in doing that? So we turn to another article here, Concerns regarding COVID-19 Church Governance and Liberty of Conscience on 2022 by the General Conference. It states, COVID immunization could be an issue of conscience for individual members with personal convictions and thus a religious liberty issue for them. So there's no argument from the church that COVID vaccines, not immunization, COVID vaccines, they say immunization, but really they mean vaccines. Anyway, they concede that it can be a religious liberty issue for individuals. Not from the church as a whole, but for individuals, it could be a religious liberty issue. So we go back now to the official statement. The official position of the church on immunization, remember this is what we're to understand their statements. This is the framework through which we're to understand their statements. We are not the conscience of the individual church member and recognize individual choices. So the church recognizes when individuals make choices based upon their convictions. So, I think we'll sum up in a minute. They also say in this one, in official statements 1995, it's gone back a bit now, but it's still just as valid now as it was when it was first resolved. Every person has a right to demand consideration whenever conscience does not allow the performance of certain public duties, such as requiring the bearing of arms. So now the church is saying, yes, we recognize it's an issue of religious liberty for some. Yes, the church recognizes the right of the individual to make a choice according to their convictions. And yes, the church recognizes that every person has a right to demand consideration whenever conscience does not allow the performance of public duty. And notice this here. The church then says, we will continue to cooperate and network with others to defend the religious liberty of all people, including those with whom we may disagree. Okay, so it sums up saying that now the church promises to defend and cooperate with and defend the religious liberty of those, even with those with whom they disagree. So let's sum it up now. A. COVID vaccines can be a religious liberty issue. So they clearly stated that. B. The church recognizes personal choice. C. The church recognizes the right of members to demand consideration when their conscience conflicts with public duty. And D. The church will cooperate with, network, and defend the religious liberty of all, including those with whom it disagrees. So we've pretty much completed the study now. We don't need to go any further because the church itself has stated that it will defend the religious liberty of all, including those with whom it disagrees, and it admits that COVID vaccines can be a religious liberty for individuals. So then it should, by its own statements, defend the religious liberty of those who desire an exemption from COVID mandates. The church recognizes it's a legitimate choice of that person because it's according to their conscience, and they recognize that that person has the right to demand consideration. And so it's going to work with the individual to obtain consideration through of the government, and it's going to defend their religious liberty. But hang on, then why do we have this statement? Vaccination program, I'll just read the part in red. Claims of religious liberty are not used appropriately in objecting to government mandates. This seems to contradict everything that they've said up to this point. Well, not that everything that I've brought up to this point. We'll go through them one by one. A. Vaccines can be a religious liberty issue. So if COVID vaccines can be a religious liberty issue, how is it then not appropriate to claim religious liberty when objecting to vaccine mandates? They say it's not appropriate to claim religious liberty, but then they also say COVID vaccines can be a religious liberty issue. Which is it? And this is in the B, C, and D statements. The church recognizes personal choice. The church recognizes the right to demand consideration when conscience conflicts with duty, and the church will cooperate with, support, and defend the religious liberty of its members, even if they disagree with them. If the church recognizes, supports, and defends those with whom vaccines are a religious liberty issue, how is it then not appropriate to claim religious liberty when objecting to vaccine mandates? See, it's almost like the church is saying one thing, but then the statement put out by the ADCOM is completely contradicting the religious liberty pronouncements of the church. The church, it sounds great what the church says. We recognize your personal choice. We recognize your right to consideration, and we will defend you. We will support you, even if we don't agree with you. But when it comes to COVID vaccine mandates, there's a problem. Now, why is that? It comes back to this. the official position of the SDA Church is really informed by the public health guidelines. That statement that we read before, they said the GC is, or the SDA Church is careful not to make pronouncements that may be construed as replacing national or international public health guidelines. So what comes first, your religious liberty or appeasing the bodies, the governmental bodies that put out these guidelines? Obviously, the health guidelines, public health guidelines by the government bodies comes first. Your religious liberty is subject to their statements. If your religious liberty contradicts the public health guidelines, you can forget having support or defense from the SDA Church, the GC in particular. So who is correct? Conrad Vine? Should the GC support religious exemptions for vaccine mandates? Of course they should. They said in all their statements from 2015, 2020, 2021, 2022, they have conceded, and not just conceded, but they have stood for truth, stood for justice, stood for religious liberty in their statements. However, we see the truth of the matter once it comes to where there's conflict with your religious liberty and the public health guidelines. They will stand with the public health guidelines rather than your religious liberty. So from its own statements, the Church has failed to defend and support religious liberty. From its own statements, from the horse's mouth, it's failed. So Conrad Vine was right. The Church has failed. It's easy to see. You know, they promise religious liberty even if they don't agree with you, and they promise they concede that religious liberty is appropriate when it comes to vaccine mandates for the individual, but as a church they can't help you. GC, and not only do they say can they not help you, but they condemn you for claiming religious liberty when it comes to the health of your body and your duty to God and preserving that health. It's quite atrocious, really, and it's a crying shame. So what about that's from the GC statements and official positions themselves. They've exposed themselves and contradicted themselves, and really they made a mess of it. They really made a mess of it when they were responding to Conrad Vine. They condemned him, banned him, censored him, and put out these sermons like comparing him to Satan, or they've really made a mess of things. So that's part one. So that's according to their own statements, according to their own position, the GC has failed. What about from a theological perspective? So are we as Seventh-day Adventists right to claim religious liberty when objecting to vaccine mandates? Now the GC said we are, and then it said we aren't, but from a theological perspective, let's see. Let's look at the Bible principles first. Of course, when we're talking about medicine, we can't forget that our body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you are not your own. So we are duty bound to God to look after this temple of ours, this dwelling place for God. And 1 Corinthians 3:17, if any man destroy the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. So there's a condemnation for those that harm the temple of God. Now this is one of the principles that we can take, like for example smoking. We know that smoking harms us, and so harm to our bodies is harm to the temple of God, and if we destroy the temple of God, God shall destroy us. There's a condemnation affixed to harming the temple of God. It is a sin to destroy your body, to hurt your body, to harm your body. And while we're mentioning it, by the way, this is of the Hippocratic Oath that the doctors take. This is the first statement they make, is first, do no harm. So the first thing in medicine is to protect the sick or the individual under treatment, and a very important thing within the theological perspective is that we should not do any harm to the temple of God, which temple you are. So if a vaccine is not shown to be safe or effective, should I take it? If I don't know the contents of the vaccine, or even if I know the contents of the vaccine but they have long names and things I don't understand, should I take that vaccine or any medication for that matter? I would say no. If a medication has not been shown to be safe or effective, I don't think you should take it. Because you're placing your body at risk, your health at risk, by taking a medication that has not been shown to be safe. Now, with medications that have been shown to be safe, there's another argument there. And if the COVID vaccines have been shown to be safe, well, that's a different argument. But just bringing it down to this base level, if the vaccine has not been shown to be safe or effective, should you take? Well, it makes absolutely no sense to take it, in my perspective. If it hasn't been shown to be safe and it hasn't been shown to be effective, then there's a chance that it's not safe and that it's not effective, and it would be a ridiculous thing to take a risk of your health for something that doesn't even work. It would be a violation of 1 Corinthians 3:17 and 1 Corinthians 6:19 to take that medication. Even though you're ignorant of it, you have no idea what it is you're taking. You have no idea what it can do to you. So your conscience should, if your conscience is not seared by the pharmaceutical ads on TV, your conscience should tell you you should not take a medication that is unproven and untested. So now your conscience comes into conflict with public duty. Say the government now mandates that you have to take this medication. To whom should you offer your obedience? Should you violate your conscience and take the untested and unproven medication or vaccine, or should you honor your duty towards God and refuse it? It should be a clear answer there. And we're saying if. So if the vaccines are unproven, untested, if the vaccines aren't shown to be safe, if the vaccine mandates conflict with when your vaccine mandates conflict with your public duty and your conscience towards God, you should not take it. So then, is it a religious liberty issue if a government mandate conflicts with your duty to God? The GC already brought up in its statement bearing arms. They say it is a religious. They said that it's a religious liberty issue with COVID vaccines. But let's just bring it back and just see if it really is. If your duty towards God conflicts with a government mandate, that is the very definition of a religious liberty issue. When we're talking about bearing arms, going to war with armed and as an armed combatant, your religion dictates that you cannot kill another person. Your religion dictates that you cannot go to war and participate in bloodshed. Therefore, since it's your religion that dictates your conviction, then it is a religious liberty issue if the government mandate conflicts with your duty to God. And so it's the same thing with these vaccines. If it is your religious duty to God to preserve the health and state of your body temple, then if the government mandate conflicts with your conscientious convictions, then it is, by definition, a religious liberty issue. So the GC already conceded that it can be a religious liberty issue, but here we can see that if your religion is conflicting with public duty, then that issue is a religious issue. It's not a personal choice issue. It's not a misinformation or disinformation issue. It's a religious liberty issue. Okay, so So we've established that. Now let's go and look what the Spirit of Prophecy says about medicine. By the use of poisonous drugs, many bring upon themselves lifelong illness, and many lives are lost that might be saved by the use of natural methods of healing. So poisonous drugs cause lifelong illness and death. Now, I know already some people are going to be saying, oh, but it says poisonous drugs. It doesn't say the modern miracle drugs that we have today. Okay, fair enough. So let's just focus on poisonous drugs for now. Can we agree that using poisonous drugs can bring upon you lifelong illness, and you can even lose your life? Can we agree with that? I mean, this is what the statement says. I don't see how you can disagree, but can we agree that poisonous drugs do that? Okay. Parents sin not only against themselves in swallowing drug poisons, but they sin against their children. So can we agree that it's a sin against yourself and your children to take poisonous drugs? Now, you can redefine drugs however you want, but for poisonous drugs, you would agree that it is a sin to take poisonous drugs. That poisonous drugs can result in death and lifelong illness. We are not excusable if through ignorance we destroy God's building by taking into the stomach poisonous drugs under a variety of names we do not understand. It is our duty to refuse all such prescriptions. So can we agree that it is our religious duty to refuse all poisonous drugs? Can we agree that if a drug is going to destroy our body, even if we're ignorant of the type of drug that it is, or the various chemical molecular makeup of the drug, if we don't understand it, if it's got a long name that we can't even pronounce, it's inexcusable to take that drug, that poisonous drug, when it's going to destroy our body. It is our religious duty to refuse such a drug. Now we come to this statement. This is where we might get a few upset Adventists. I do not think that I can give you any definite line of medicines compounded and dealt out by doctors that are perfectly harmless. So this is, I'm not exactly sure when this is written, but we know it's obviously written before 1915. So people are going to say, oh, but they didn't have the modern drugs that we have today. You know, we've got all the technology to understand and investigate and research and find the drugs that are perfectly harmless. Well, I've got news for you. There is almost no drug. The statement still stands true to this day. There is almost no drug that is perfectly harmless. In fact, the drugs that are considered quite benign and harmless are some of the worst. Paracetamol is a good example of this. Aspirin is a dangerous drug. Now, of course, I'm not going to kill you the first pill that you take, but you know, after years of ingesting paracetamol or different concoctions that are dealt out by the doctors, you're going to end up with kidney damage, liver damage, all sorts of things. So there's almost no medications that have no potential side effects, and most of them are quite dangerous. Drugging should be forever banned, for while it does not cure any malady, it enfeebles the system, making it more susceptible to disease. Now, we're not talking about poisonous drugs or harmless drugs in this statement. She's talking about drugging in general, that it should be forever abandoned. This is talking about the method of treating the sick, and that we should, as far as possible, avoid drugging. We should avoid drugs as far as possible. Thousands have gone down to the grave because of the use of poisonous drugs, who might have been restored to health by simple methods of treatment. So, we'll continue on. Our institutions are established that the sick may be treated by hygienic methods, discarding almost entirely the use of drugs. So we should discard almost entirely the use of drugs and depend upon hygienic methods for healing. So we've got a dichotomy here that God is trying to enlighten his people. You've got the allopathic method, where medications are used often to treat the symptoms and to provide relief from disease and sickness. And then we've got the natural method, where the root cause is dealt with and the healing power of the body itself is recognized as the primary force for healing, for the primary method of getting well. So it's supporting the human body and allowing it to restore and recuperate by itself, along with other treatments such as hydrotherapy and maybe herbs, things like that. But ultimately the ideas are completely opposed. We have nature's healing capabilities that God has instilled in every one of us in our bodies, and then we have the forceful drug medication which forces disease out of the body to disastrous results in many cases. So, summary of E.G. White and the Bible: the body is the temple of God. It is our duty to care for it and a sin to harm it. It is our duty to refuse medicines which harm the body and a sin to take them. We are to depend upon nature and hygienic principles for treating disease, educating ourselves away from medications. Now I know, so we've already been through the part that people say, oh, she was talking about large doses of quinine, and she's talking about giving mercury for different sicknesses and things like that, giving these strong drugs for certain sicknesses. Well, we still give strong drugs today. I mean, some of the drugs just about kill you when you take them, if you're talking about chemotherapy. But, I mean, I was fortunate that I was right in the middle of a pharmacology degree when COVID-19 came about, and we were studying we spent, I don't know, 1 lecture or 2 lectures or more on the harmful nature of drug medications, even the seemingly harmless ones that we've already discussed. So there are no harmless drugs. All drugs have side effects and can have complications. And it's our duty to refuse medications that are going to do harm to the body. Now, I'm not saying we should never take drugs, of course. I mean, there's a place for drugs in certain circumstances. You know, it'll be a sin to refuse to offer pain relief the pain relief medication to someone who's in agony. That would be crazy. So we're not saying we're not anti-medication, but we are saying that we should do our utmost to depend upon nature and hygienic principles for treating disease instead of using medications. We should put medications far, far, far below where they stand today. So we understand these 3 principles, that it's a sin to harm the temple of God, where it's a sin to take poisonous medications, and the method of treating disease should be depending upon nature and not upon medication. So when we come to the COVID vaccines, we want to know first that the vaccines are safe. If they're not, if we can't be assured of their safety, then it will be a sin to risk harming the temple of God and our health and our usefulness in this life and the next. So we want to know that the vaccines are safe. I mean, that's just, they call it informed consent, but I mean, that's just common sense, really, that we want to know something's safe before we're going to ingest it. I mean, it would be crazy to just ingest everything and anything that the doctors tell us we should. I mean, this is what was happening back in her time when they were ingesting mercury in huge amounts. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that we don't need to be assured of the safety of a vaccine. So of course, that should go without saying. We need to know that the vaccines are safe, and second, we need to know that they are effective and that the situation warrants a departure from depending upon natural agencies. Our default method of treating disease is with natural agencies. So if we're going to depart from that and depend upon medication, we need to know that the situation warrants it. And we need to know that the vaccines are effective. Okay, let's go through this. The vaccines are safe. What is the best indicator of vaccine or any medication safety? What is the best indicator? Now, I had a very revealing email conversation with the head of the pharmacology department in university about this very topic. How do we know that the vaccines are safe? And most of his response was in theory. So in theory, the RNA is going to degrade in the body within 2 weeks, and there will be no trace left of the RNA, and the other lipid nanoparticles, for example, and other things will also degrade or be excreted, and so there's no risk to your health in taking the vaccines. So that's the theory behind the safety. But the best indicator of medication, of the safety of a medication, is a long-term study. There's no substitute for a long-term study when it comes to safety. You can have all the theory in the world that you like, but humans are fallible. Humans miss things. Humans guess things. So humans make mistakes, and with theory come mistakes, but with long-term studies come results. So what did the long-term studies say about these vaccines? Well, there were no long-term studies. There cannot be long-term studies for a medication that is just released upon the market. And might we say that the vaccines, when they were released, they were not even released as FDA-approved medications. They were released as emergency use medications. Licensed for emergency use. So they could bypass all the safety protocols, not all of them, but bypass a lot of the safety protocols. And because it's an emergency, so an emergency warrants us to get this vaccine onto the market as soon as possible. But the problem with that is they could well be safe, but there's no long-term study to guarantee their safety. Now that's the problem. You can have all the experts lined up in a row. Fauci, and if you're from New Zealand, you had Chris, I can't remember his name, Jacinda Ardern, and even President Trump. You have people promoting the vaccine and its safety and effectiveness, but they can't guarantee it. They can say it, but they can't guarantee it because there were no long-term studies. Second, almost all medications carry risk. So when they say you had it driven into your head day after day, week after week, that the vaccines are safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective, especially in the news media, that was their go-to line about every 30 seconds, it's safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. However, they call it safe, but every medication carries risk. Just about every medication carries risk. And the crazy thing is that the vaccine insert stated such serious risks, potential risks. COVID-19 vaccines demonstrate increased risks of myocarditis and pericarditis, particularly within the first week following vaccination. So when they say it's safe, what do they mean? Because clearly there's a risk involved. And this is just one risk, and this was a risk that showed up in the clinical trials prior to the international rollout of the vaccines. So this isn't even considering what risks might be revealed when you have a long-term study. These were just the risks of the short-term studies. So there is a risk. All medications carry risk, and there is a risk of myocarditis and pericarditis when you take the COVID-19 vaccine. So when they say they're safe, they're redefining the term safe. If safe means perfectly harmless, benign, and no risk, that's not what they meant. That's what we understand with safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. That's all we understand when they say it's safe, that it means it's not going to harm you. But that's not what they mean, because it carries risk, and they even have it in the package insert. Manufacturers themselves listed serious possible side effects in package inserts, so that safety cannot be guaranteed for the vaccines. Now, talking about effectiveness, safe and effective, talking about the effectiveness, studies on preventing transmission would show if you have a decrease in transmission rates following a COVID-19 vaccine. If you have a study that's somehow they can formulate and perform a clinical trial where they can study the transmission rates of placebo and COVID-19 vaccinated groups. However, there were no studies regarding the efficacy of vaccines preventing transmission. There were no studies about transmission. So they can say it's safe and effective, but they don't really mean safe when they say it's safe, because there's risks involved. And when they say effective, they don't mean in preventing transmission. And on top of this, they know that the effectiveness, what effectiveness there is in a vaccine, wanes over time. So it decreases over time. So how many months will it take for the vaccine that I have to be rendered completely useless? Well, that's why they develop the boosters, and you have your first booster, your second booster, your third booster, your fourth booster, your fifth booster. And it just got out of control. But the worst part of it was that no studies were done on the effectiveness of vaccines preventing transmission, and the entire focus of the government mandates was to prevent transmission. So they're saying safe and effective. It hasn't been shown to be safe, and it hasn't been shown to be effective. If we're talking about it hasn't been shown that there's no risk, and it hasn't been shown that it prevents transmission. So the efficacy of preventing transmission cannot be guaranteed. So if we want to know, before we have a COVID vaccine, and we want to preserve our body in the state of health, and we want our conscience to be clear that we're not taking a poisonous drug, we need to know if the vaccines are safe, and we need to know if the vaccine's effective. And on top of that, we need to know if the situation warrants us departing from relying upon natural agencies. So there was no guarantee of safety, and there were known risks. And there was no guarantee of vaccine efficacy in preventing transmission, and there is a known decrease in vaccine efficacy over time. And in this case, they're talking about the viral load in your body, that over time the vaccine, if the antibodies produced by the vaccine begin to decrease until after a certain amount of time, when you get infected with the virus, it's almost like you've had no vaccine. So there's a known decrease in the vaccine efficacy, and there's no studies, no guarantee of vaccine efficacy in preventing transmission. So everything that you need to know before taking a medication, you don't know. So for some, taking COVID vaccines meant departing from God's instructions and dispensing with medications and depending upon nature in combating disease. It meant that we're jeopardizing, or at least potentially jeopardizing, the health of the temple of their body by taking medication with no long-term studies, and then that we're doing this with no evidence that such action would contribute to public health. Remember, the whole purpose of the vaccine mandates, or the primary purpose of the vaccine mandates, was to prevent transmission. slow the spread, as they say. Okay, there's a secondary benefit in that if the vaccines decreased hospitalizations, then the hospitals wouldn't be overburdened. But then that's not a public health measure, that's an individual choice to make. If whether the hospitals are overburdened or not, if it only involves me, it's my choice whether if there's room for me in the hospital or to be treated if it comes to the point that I need to be hospitalized. However, when it's talking about public health, the primary motivation for the vaccine mandates was to prevent or slow transmission, of which there were no studies performed at the release of the vaccines and at the time of the mandates. So it's a violation of individuals' conscience regarding their duty towards their Creator. Vaccine mandates were an issue of religious liberty in which the GC failed to support its members, defend their rights and uphold the principles of our faith. They said they would do this, but they did not do it. It would be a violation of our conscientious duty toward God to take a medication that we don't know its safety profile, and we don't know, it's through long-term studies, and we don't know its efficacy in preventing transmission. And we don't know that the actual COVID-19 situation demanded that we should depart from, depending upon nature. It's fundamentally a religious liberty issue, and the GC admitted that, but then it failed to defend its members. We encourage responsible immunization vaccination and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents to responsibly participate in protective and preventative immunization programs. So what they're saying here is that in the SDA religion, there is no religious or faith-based reason not to take the vaccine. You've got to remember that when we're reading this, we have to read this as we were the eyes of the government. Say and a member of the SDA church has applied to the government for an exemption of for the vaccine mandates. Now the government says, okay, now let me investigate your church and your creed as to whether or not your religion provides a basis for this exemption. And then they read this, that the members of the SDA church have no religious or faith-based reason to not take the vaccine. I'll just paraphrase what they're saying here, because it's like a lawyer's written all of this. They say no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage our adherents. Yeah, we're not talking about yeah. So they have no religious or faith-based reason to not participate in vaccination programs. So they've just pulled the rug out from under your feet if you're depending upon the church to get an exemption. This is what they're saying. I've already said this 100 times. We'll say it again. There is no religious basis. This is just my words. There is no religious basis in our church for not taking the vaccine. People who refuse the vaccine do so without our support. We do not acknowledge any religious or faith-based reason for a vaccine exemption. And it might not be, it's not a perfect paraphrase of what they've said here, because what they've said is very, it's written in a way that it's very hard to really understand what they're saying. Because here they're not actually talking about the individuals participating in immunization programs, they're talking about the church encouraging or not encouraging participation in the vaccination programs. And so they're sort of freeing themselves from responsibility and accountability by saying, oh no, the government can read it how it wants, and we'll read it how we want. But that's the problem, because the government will read it how it wants. And the way that they've worded it, the government will read it like this, that there is no religious or faith-based reason for not taking the vaccine. Your church does not provide, or your church actually revokes the idea, not even revokes, sorry, it rebukes the idea that there is a faith-based or religious reason for not taking the vaccine. And the church emphatically stated this in that first quote, the contentious quote that from the AdCom committee, that said it's not appropriate to make religious liberty claims when objecting to vaccine mandates. So that the church, they said it in a very sneaky way here, but they said it plain as day in that AdCom statement. So at least we we can be grateful to the church for not being so beating around the bush as they were in this statement. So again, reason for conscientious objection to the mandates: we have Bible reasons, we have Ellen G. White reasons, and we have scientific reasons. However, they conflict with the public health guidelines, which the church is subordinate to, or has subordinated herself to, and therefore there is no exemption for those whose convictions lead them to object to vaccine mandates. And that is the end of part 1. We'll just read this. The SDA General Conference abandoned their conscientious members who reasonably objected to taking a medication that had no guarantee of safety or efficacy. They refused to support those who, for sake of conscience and duty to God, stood true to their convictions. The church failed. It failed big time when it came to the vaccine mandates, and it failed big time when it came to responding to those, especially to Conrad Vine and to those who objected to its statement in the 2021 AdCom committee. Now, this outcome is unsurprising because the exact same thing has happened before with the SDA Church. The exact same abandonment of its people, abandonment of being the defender of religious liberty has happened before, and it will happen again. We're going to look at how it happened before and the exact parallels that we can draw from it and the predictions that we can make in the next study.